Hey, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Chinese Historical and Cultural Project webinar. Hello, my name is Erwin Wong, and I'm the director of the CHCP Speaker Series. This webinar is co-sponsored by CHCP and AAACNA, that's African, Asian American, Chicano, and Native American Studies Center, San Jose State University, King Library. And thanks goes out to AAACNA as a value partner. Now, a little bit about CHCP. The Chinese Historical and Cultural Project is a nonprofit organization that was founded in 1987 and is based in Santa Clara County, California. We promote and preserve Chinese American, Chinese history, and cultural through community outreach activities. And if you get a chance, please log in onto our website, chcp.org, and check out our virtual tour of our museum, which, by the way, is located in the History Park in San Jose, California. So with this said, today we have a very special guest, Dr. Charles Egan, who will be presenting the Pre-World War II Poetry of Chinese, Japanese, and Korean Immigrants with Comparison. Dr. Christian Jochen, our co-president of CHCP, will introduce Dr. Egan and tell you a little bit about our guests. But before we start, there will be a Q&A session after Dr. Egan's presentation, and you can enter your questions on your Q&A icon located on your monitor screen, either above or below your screen. Anytime during the webinar, you can enter your question. And however, due to the time constraint on this webinar, we will do our best to answer as many questions as possible. So with this said, here's Chris.
Now that I'm unmuted, I will say hi, everyone, and thank you for the nice introduction, Erwin. And I'm going to have the pleasure of introducing our speaker, Charles Egan, who is at San Francisco State University, where he teaches about Chinese language and Chinese culture. He's a professor there and also serving as the chair of the Department of Modern Language and Literature. His work in this area has been very well received, and in fact, his previous work on Chinese poetry, called Clouds Thick, Whereabouts Unknown, Poems from the Zen Monks of China, won the Lucian Strick Prize in Asian Translation from the American Literary Translators Association. So we would anticipate that he would be able to do really nice translations of the Chinese poetry that was inscribed on the walls of the Angel Island Immigration Station barrack. And indeed, I was able to get a hold of his brand new book, and I was really taken by surprise at not only the quality of the translations, but the way in which Charles was able to bring forth the feelings and experience of the immigrants who had written the poetry. The interesting thing about the book is that it actually goes beyond the inscriptions of the Chinese detainees at the Angel Island Immigration Station. It has a long chapter on Chinese inscriptions, but it has equally long chapters on the works of Japanese and Korean immigrants. And there are others, Russians and Jews and people from Latin America. But tonight, Charles is going to talk to us about the Chinese, Japanese, and Korean immigrant contributions to the Inscriptions and Immigrant Poetry produced by people who went through Angel Island from 1910 to 1940. So Charles, I'll let you take it from there.
All right, well, thank you very much. Good evening, everybody. I'm glad to see you. Thank you, Chris and Erwin, for inviting me. I'm looking forward to letting you know some of the research that I've been working on. What I'll try to do tonight is to talk about these three different groups: the Chinese, the Japanese, and the Koreans, their experiences at the island, and how their experiences affected their poetry, their reasons and even topics for writing poetry differed quite a lot, so I hope you'll find it of interest. Let me just share my screen. I've got slides for about half of the presentation or so. Let's see. Go here. Let me go up here. Let's see. Try to get the slideshow thing, but the there we go. Slideshow from beginning. Okay. There we go. The Angel Island Immigration Station officially opened its doors on January 21st, 1910. Although often called the Ellis Island of the West, in fact, the site never became a portal like its eastern counterpart. Instead, it functioned as a detention facility for all the years of its operations. It had been built in large part to discourage Asian immigration. Those arriving at the port of San Francisco whose status was not in question and whose papers were in order were processed at the wharves where the passenger ships docked. Problem cases were sent to Angel Island, where the wait for adjudication could last a few days or many months. The old station barracks contains an extraordinary archive. Hundreds of poems and prose records in multiple languages are on the walls, inscribed by immigrant detainees between 1910 and 1940, and by POWs and enemy aliens during World War II. Chinese remains the dominant language on the walls, but Japanese is also strongly represented, and Russian, English, Spanish, Italian, French, German, Punjabi, Bengali, and Korean are also found. The Chinese writing at the station is widely known and is compelling because so much of it is poetry. Chinese detainees express their feelings of sadness, anger, and hope in scores of poems in classical forms. A group of 135 of these Chinese poems, augmented by individual stories of immigrants and a capsule history of the Chinese experience at the immigration station, formed the 1980 collection, Island, Poetry and History of Chinese Immigrants on Angel Island, by Him Mark Lai, Jenny Lim, and Judy Yong. A revised edition was published in 2014. The book is a classic in the history of the immigration experience, and many of the issues it raises concerning policies of exclusion, racial and cultural bias, fear of the immigrant other, and institutionalized inequality are as topical today as they were when it was published or when the poems were written. Yet the book was so influential that many members of the public think of Angel Island only in the context of Chinese American history. My new book, Voices of Angel Island, aims to broaden that view by transcribing and researching a selection of wall inscriptions in all the languages represented there, augmented by literary materials from Bay Area ethnic newspapers. Historians Erica Lee and Judy Yong estimate that 300,000 aliens were sent to Angel Island for immigration inspection between 1910 and 1940. 100,000 Chinese, 85,000 Japanese, 8,000 South Asians, 8,000 Russians and Jews, 1,000 Koreans, 1,000 Filipinos, and 400 Mexicans. Other immigrants were from Australia and New Zealand, the Polynesian Islands, Southeast Asia, Europe, South and Central America, People of 80 nationalities entering the port of San Francisco all ended up in Angel Island, sent there when the authorities deemed that their entry applications required investigation. Voices of Angel Island adds dozens more Chinese inscriptions to the record and has separate chapters on Japanese, Korean, and European other immigrants, as well as a chapter on Angel Island in World War II. Each text tells the story of an individual, but taken together, they illuminate historical, economic, and cultural forces that shaped the lives of ordinary people in the early 20th century. While the Chinese were the only group who carved poems on the walls in great numbers, they were by no means the only group to write poetry about their immigration experience. There were great numbers of Japanese and Korean poems published in Bay Area ethnic newspapers. Today, I'd like to share and discuss examples of the poems by all these East Asian groups in turn. To prefigure my conclusions, the collections of the three have very different thematic arcs. The experience of arriving Chinese travelers during the years when the Angel Island Immigration Station was in operation was dictated by the terms of the Chinese Exclusion Act, which by 1910 had already been in force for almost 3 decades. The act stated that, in the opinion of the government of the United States, the coming of Chinese laborers to this country endangers the good order of certain localities within the territory thereof. It excluded Chinese skilled and unskilled laborers and Chinese employed in mining from entering the country. Only a few classes of people were exempt: government officials, merchants, teachers, students, visitors, and family members of US citizens. Thus, throughout the period from 1910 to 1940, when the immigration station was in operation, Chinese arrivals at San Francisco needed to qualify as members of one of these classes to gain admission. Government officials, teachers, students, and visitors were a tiny minority of the total. More claimed merchant status, for example, by providing documentation and witness testimony of partnerships, fictional or otherwise, in businesses in the United States. Yet most Chinese would-be immigrants attempted to prove they were family dependents of US male citizens. As naturalization was barred to Asians until the Magnuson Act of 1943, for anyone of Chinese extraction to be a citizen required native birth in the United States. Those without true fathers in the United States often became paper sons or paper daughters. They were provided or purchased false papers identifying them as children of Chinese men who were US citizens. Because official records were so scarce, the immigration authorities had to rely on an interrogation system to match the stories of the applicants with those of the supposed fathers and supporting witnesses. To pass the hearings to the authorities' satisfaction, applicants had to flawlessly relate minute details about family genealogy and village life. As described by the authors of Island, regardless of the validity of the Chinese arrival's claim for entry, he or she prepared by memorizing detailed coaching books. The cumbersomeness of the process resulted in long delays and meant that at any one time, Chinese were the largest group of detainees. To pass the time, many carved poems on the walls. I love this picture, by the way, because somebody has written in on the right-hand side, our time of torture. This is visiting the hospital during the Angel Island immigration process. Indeed, writing poetry on the walls was already a tradition when the Angel Island station opened. There are references to Chinese poems written on the walls of the old wooden building on the Pacific Mail Steamship Company wharf in San Francisco, where Chinese immigrants were detained prior to 1910. There are strong cultural reasons that moved Chinese immigrants to inscribe poems on the walls. Poetry was the dominant medium of artistic expression in old China. Public poetry held a special social and ritual function, whether inscribed on a building, a tablet placed at an important site, or even carved on the side of a cliff. Generally, such inscriptions have advocated harmony in the common good, and without them, the place remained somehow incomplete. The written word was needed to both express and maintain the proper relationships among heaven, earth, and man. A modern counterpart can be seen every Chinese New Year when people paste 对联, New Year's couplets, to the sides of their doors to ensure peace and prosperity for their families. Yet poetry had another public purpose as well. This medium was commonly used by the upright scholar to decry injustice and champion the oppressed. Speaking truth to power, even at personal risk, was demanded by the Confucian moral code. Moreover, whether invocation or complaint, the beauty of Chinese calligraphy makes public texts not only literary communications, but also art objects for viewers to enjoy. It is clear that every poet represented at Angel Island felt a strong responsibility to express the communal feelings of all his fellow immigrants about their detention and about the future. The poems on the walls reflect a community of shared experiences and values, and were a source of solidarity for detainees trapped in a limbo between the old country and the new. Classical Chinese poetry is a lyric tradition. Thus, most poems are short, generally less than a dozen lines, evocations of human feeling. The great majority of the poems at the station employ the standard shi forms and average 4 to 8 lines. These forms are unfailingly regular. The line length is either pentasyllabic or heptasyllabic throughout. Each line is divided in 2, 3, or 4 3-syllable segments. Pairs of lines form couplets, and a rhyme falls at the end of every couplet, and sometimes the first line. The shi forms derive from a tradition going back 2,000 years. It is notable that none of the Angel Island examples uses the experimental free verse that was in vogue among Chinese urban intellectuals in the early 20th century. The immigrant authors were mostly boys and young men from rural villages in Guangdong, and they responded to their detention experience in traditional ways. Just to start us off, let me read 2 examples from Island that are on my favorites list. The following ancient style verse, 古诗, is number 24 in the collection. Ancient verse can vary in line length, unlike another type called recent style verse. And this is the poem that I'm reading right now, Random Thoughts Deep at Night. In the quiet of night, I heard faintly the whistling of wind. The forms and shadows saddened me. Upon seeing the landscape, I composed a poem. The floating clouds, the fog darken the sky. The moon shines faintly as the insects chirp. Grief and bitterness entwined our heaven sent. The sad person sits alone, leaning by a window. Written by Yi of Toisan. So 深夜偶感，夜静微闻风萧声，形影伤情见仅有。云雾潺潺也暗天，虫声轻轻月微明。悲苦相连千相牵，愁人独坐一窗边。台山鱼题。The author integrates the images around him with his melancholy. A seamless union of feeling and scene was a desired quality in traditional Chinese poetry. One of the most moving poems in the collection is number 112, which is this is the original carving on the wall. The second of a pair eulogizing a detainee who had sickened and died at the station. Although there are many rumors of Chinese detainees committing suicide at the building, most of those are rumors. There is only one Chinese detainee who clearly did commit suicide at the station in 19. I think it was 1923 or something like that. But there were many examples of people who died of illness at the station. Either illnesses they had when they arrived, or there were also some certain outbreaks of disease at the station, which also were important, like meningitis outbreaks. So this poem reads, shocking news, truly sad, reached my ears. We mourn you. When will they wrap your corpse for return? You cannot close your eyes. On whom are you depending to voice your complaints? If you had foresight, you should have regretted coming here. Now you will be forever sad and forever resentful. Thinking of the village, one can only futilely face the terrace for gazing homeward. Before you could fulfill your lofty goals, you were buried beneath clay and earth. I know that even death could not destroy your ambition. The poet's cry of grief is presented using one of the recent style verse forms, the heptasyllabic regulated verse, 律诗. This form and its pentasyllabic counterpart are fixed at 8 lines. There's also a fixed quatrain form, also in the recent style verse forms. Particularly challenging is the requirement that strict patterns of the Chinese tones must be followed. Suffice to say that observing the patterns properly is not easy. The above poem follows the rules perfectly. Regulated verse also stipulates that the middle 2 couplets be syntactically parallel. The second couplet here is indeed parallel. The third couplet is not, yet it is a powerful statement. The allusion to the terrace for gazing homeward is particularly apt. In Chinese popular mythology, it is the place in the netherworld where the recently deceased can look back at the land of the living for the last time. The calligraphy of the Chinese inscriptions is remarkably good. Traditional education began with the art of the brush and daily copying of the works of the masters. The revered place of writing in Chinese culture has philosophical roots. It was held that calligraphy, even more than the other arts, is the spontaneous and concrete expression of inner spiritual states. Most of the Angel Island inscriptions reflect the vigorous yet elegant standard kaishu style used in Qing Dynasty woodblock printed books and government documents. This style was designed for efficiency, but also to impress with its bold strength. Long sweeping lines and sharp angles characterize kaishu. There are many calligraphy models to choose from for studying kaishu. For convenience, let us categorize Angel Island examples using the contrasting styles of the 2 most influential early kaishu masters. And the first one here, this one is by Yan Zhenqing, a general in the Tang Dynasty. And then Liu Gongquan was an official also in the Tang Dynasty, slightly later than General Yan. Both are outstanding examples of the kaishu aesthetic, yet Yan figured thick, almost blocky strokes that gave his characters weight and monumentality, as here. At Angel Island, compare island number 60, and you can certainly see the resemblance there. Liu, on the other hand, used more slender strokes that are hard and sharp, which gave his characters lightness and energy. At Angel Island, compare island number 2 here. Also with these thin lines with tensile strength. The styles of the 2 calligraphers are seen as complementary, the muscle of Yan and the bone of Liu. Some of the best calligraphic examples at Angel Island reflect a more individual running standard Xingkai style. The standard kaishu aesthetic remains, but the writer adapts it for rapid brushwork. The strokes tend to run together as the brush moves over the surface, creating a graceful interplay of curves to balance the strong skeletal structure. Each character is a fixed record of the subtle movement of the brush. And as character succeeds character, the piece emerges organically and dynamically. A fine example is this one. The rest of the Chinese poems I'll share today are new ones from my book, Deciphered from the Walls. The themes are similar to those in the Island collection: homesickness and sadness, indignation about detention, trepidation about possibly deportation, expressions of patriotism to China and despair at China's weakness, and the desire for revenge. One new type can best be described as advice for compatriots. Examples provide cautionary information about barracks life and immigration regulations. All of the Chinese poems were written before any of the writers had been allowed entry to America. Their knowledge of life in America was vague at best. So let's see here. Let me start with this one. Clouds and hills all around, a single fresh color. Time slips away and cannot be recaptured. Although the feeling of spring is everywhere, how can we fulfill our heartfelt wish? Inscribed by a traveler from the city of Iron in Xiangshan. That's Shiqi in Zhongshan County. I begged my friends and neighbors and thought of 1,000 plans in order to borrow several $100s because I wanted to do business in Mexico. It seems like I'm being punished for some transgression. 3 times I've asked the governor, why am I imprisoned on this island? And here, this one is by Lehigh here. The following poem is this picture. It's been a long time since I left my home village. Who could know I'd end up imprisoned in a wooden building? I'm heartsick when I see my reflection. My handkerchief is soaked in tears. I ask you, what crime did I commit to deserve this? Inscribed by Lehigh, South Village, Taishan. This is an interesting one because it's not actually a poem. It's more of a prose piece with very, very strongly Confucian sentiments in it. It's useless to become friends with those of narrow mind. It's useless to have wealth if one disdains the poor. It's useless to show off one's cleverness in daily affairs. Understanding human nature all comes from learning. Attention to details leads one to the proper way. There are one thing I found quite interesting is I found 6 different poems written by a single detainee who must have been there for quite a while to do all that work. These are actually on the 2nd floor, and strangely enough, they're not in the Chinese dormitories. They're in the sitting rooms that were used for Japanese and Europeans. But this is the first poem of a first set of 4 I'm going to read right now, and then I'll read 2 more in a minute. Dwelling in the wooden building, I give in to despair. Between high hills and the ferry pier, my brows furrow in pain. Letters do not arrive, my thoughts hopeless. In bitterness and sadness, I watch for my early release. Viewing the landscape arouses deep feelings. Sadness strikes the prisoner in the wooden building. Harsh treatment is hard to bear, and my heart is breaking. After more than a month of wandering, tears wet my cheeks. The ancestral land is in chaos, and vile practices remain. More and more each day, diehards exert their tyrannical power. Who can unify the affairs of the Han people? All compatriots overseas should build a bridge home. Experiencing parting is the saddest thing. When holidays come, I remember my family even more. From afar, I know my brothers are climbing to a high place. Dogwood sprays in their clothes, short one man. Inscribed by Huang Zuming, a passenger on the SS China. That last poem there is only partially original. The first line is his, but the following 3 follow a very famous poem by the Tang Dynasty poet Wang Wei. And this is on the opposite wall, but by the same writer. He writes, I'm distressed our ancestral land is in such peril, slashed and gouged for over 200 years. Compatriots must renew their will to strengthen the country. Chinese from then on will have no sadness. The national shame is hard to forget, and we became prisoners. What joy is here for heroes? We must soon unite. In years to come, when there is a gathering of warriors, I wish to go back, strap on my armor, and take my vengeance. The following poem is not actually to be found on the wall, but it clearly was there. The authors of Island were able to locate 2 manuscripts written by detainees in the early 1930s, and those detainees thought the poems were fascinating, and they went all around the building transcribing things, which became a big source for the poems that were published in the book Island. Well, one of the poems that is in those manuscripts, but hasn't been published before, is quite a lovely poem. It must have been there because both the detainees copied it down, and they were there at different times. So clearly it was on the walls, but it can't be found now. There has been damage to the building from water damage, or in some cases from alterations. So that's probably what happened. But it's quite a lovely poem. While on ship, the waves filled the sky. I endured bitterness and sorrow. Upon arrival, I met with cruelty and was imprisoned in a jail. I've drifted into Yoli and recall sorrow on top of sorrow. The family at home leans on the gate and stares. Broken-hearted, they long for one far away. My hard life and my family poverty bring two streams of tears. If one day I can land on this shore, then I'll attain my heart's desire. The reference to Yoli there is an ancient historical reference to King I of the Zhou dynasty, who had been imprisoned at Yoli by the tyrannical emperor of the previous dynasty. Then the next two are more in this advice for compatriots kind of vein. And this one you see is written in kind of scrawly calligraphy, but it's very heartfelt. When leaving home, don't show your wealth to prying eyes. In my pants, I also had silver dollars. I hung the pants on the bed without a care. In a flash, they were stolen, and I'm so angry I cannot speak. I'm heartsick for my mother, who sold everything for me. That bastard son of a turtle is so barbaric. And also up in that same room, when you go downstairs for meals, you should beware of thieves. Take your money with you to avoid big loss of wealth. Although there are thieves among us, carefully follow this rule. To be prepared is to avoid disaster, and in due time you can leave here. This picture is just a fragment of a poem. It's actually one of two poems, but I mention it because it is the earliest dated inscription I could find at the building. Now the building was open from 1910 to 1940 as an immigration center. The first Chinese Revolution was into October of 1911. This poem dates from before that, because it has the reign title of the last emperor in the date, Xuantong. I can't tell if it's Xuantong II or Xuantong III. Either way, this is before the revolution. And there are two poems, one of which is only partially deciphered. This one reads, "It's hard for Chinese to come to America. There is so much sadness in this place. The foreign slaves have always bullied and cheated our country. When the people are rich and strong, we'll destroy the foreign lands." I floated 10,000 miles across the Pacific Sea, yet before the waves were stilled, I was detained in prison grounds. For the sake of my studies, I never complained of hardship, but who knew there would be such high debts to pay? For 3 months, I have been continuously imprisoned. This year has every day brought me 9 rounds of sorrow. Heaven has eyes and molds heroes' bones through suffering. And now I'm at a dead end and wipe the tracks of my tears. And finally, just two last poems here. This one reads, "I tended house and home for dozens of years. After thinking it over 1,000 times, I began this journey. When I arrived at the island, I was put in the detention center. Who knew that even Mexico forbids entrance?" Yeah, okay. Let's see, stop share. Okay, now I'd like to go on and talk a little bit about the Japanese inscriptions, or Japanese poetry in particular, which was not really written on the walls much. There are a couple of Japanese poems on the walls, but they're from the World War II period. But as I say, the Japanese wrote poetry all the time in the newspapers. For Japanese immigrants, the so-called Gentleman's Agreement of 1907 to 1908 was the major factor governing immigration practices until 1924. Immigration of Japanese had been relatively free since 1894 under the terms of the U.S.-Japan Treaty of Commerce and Navigation, and the number of Japanese workers in California, Oregon, and Washington had swelled, particularly in agriculture. The territory of Hawaii attracted even larger numbers. 30,000 Japanese contract laborers were there by 1885. By the early 20th century, anti-Japanese sentiment had also grown. The Asiatic Exclusion League, a powerful voice for restricting immigration through to the end of World War II, in fact was founded in 1905 as the Japanese and Korean Exclusion League. In 1906, the school board in San Francisco voted to ban Japanese and Korean children from public schools that serve the general population, and instead required them to attend a newly established Oriental public school, along with Chinese children. The Japanese government was offended by this and other acts of discrimination, and so entered negotiations on the immigration issue with President Theodore Roosevelt. Japan agreed not to issue passports to any more laborers intending to immigrate to the continental US or the territory of Hawaii. Professional classes were exempt, as were laborers returning to a domicile or farm formerly acquired. While Roosevelt agreed to intervene in the San Francisco school plan and not to move forward on a formal exclusion law aimed at the Japanese. A key exception in the agreement was to have far-reaching consequences. Parents, spouses, and children of Japanese residents in the US could be allowed passports and entry. One unanticipated result from the US perspective was the coming of the picture brides and the ensuing growth of the Japanese community. Young women in Japan were legally married to absent bridegrooms residing in the United States, often with their only previous contact, the exchange of photographs and correspondence. The new brides then were given valid passports to travel to this country to meet their husbands. The Japanese government watched over the system. All prospective bridegrooms had to meet a financial standard, in mid-1915 set at $800 in savings. Brides had to be officially registered with their bridegroom's household in Japan at least 6 months before they could travel abroad, and could not be more than 13 years younger than their spouses. US authorities were at first perplexed by the practice and how to reconcile it with domestic marriage law. Between 1910 and 1920, when Japan agreed to stop issuing passports to picture brides by the terms of the so-called Ladies' Agreement, between 6,000 and 10,000 were processed through Angel Island, in addition to the thousands of Japanese men who applied for entry through various exemptions. Nearly 20,000 picture brides settled in Hawaii about the same time. At the insistence of the Immigration Service, grooms were required to come in person to Angel Island to meet their brides. The thought of the many happy meetings that occurred there partially counterbalances the weight of heartache of Angel Island detainees. The opening of the Angel Island Immigration Station coincided with a transitional period for the Japanese community. As the scholar Yuji Ichioka explains, the history of Japanese immigration can be divided into two broad periods, 1885 to 1907 and 1908 to 1924. The first is characterized by the dekasegi ideal, which refers to the practice of Japanese laborers leaving their homes temporarily to work elsewhere. Implicit was the idea that the workers would return home to Japan later. Japanese in California at this period were predominantly laborers who engaged in railroad construction or agricultural work, often living in primitive and temporary camps, kampu, in rural areas. Populated at first entirely by men, life there was harsh and leisure was often devoted to drinking and gambling. Subsequent to the gentleman's agreement, visionary community leaders like Kyotaro Abiko, founder and publisher of the Nichibei Shimbun, the Japanese American news, called for Dochaku Eiju, settlement of this land and permanent residency. A campaign in the newspaper railed against drinking and gambling in the camps and encouraged picture bride marriages and self-sufficiency through agriculture. Changes in US law closed the window on almost all Asian immigration. The Immigration Act of 1917 created an Asiatic barred zone, which covered South and Southeast Asia, the Polynesian Islands, Asiatic Russia, and parts of Arabia and Afghanistan. The act effectively broadened the Chinese Exclusion Act to cover all these localities. Japan was not included because it was an ally during World War I, but this was to change. The Immigration Act of 1924 included a provision that barred entry to any person who was not eligible for naturalization, which effectively excluded Japanese without having to mention them specifically. Poems and other literary materials were regularly published in Nichibei. Many were submitted by readers and then were selected by the editors for publication. Others were likely written by the editors and staff themselves. The topics cover the gamut of Japanese immigrant life in the period: Angel Island and Picture Brides, homesickness for Japan, perspectives on San Francisco and California life and scenery, farm work in the Central Valley, and complaints about discriminatory laws and treatment. A particular focus is on life in camp. Camp refers to any of the temporary work camps in the Central Valley where Japanese migrant laborers found themselves. But camp in Nichibei also refers to the utopian Yamato colony and similar settlements. Many poems document the arrival of wives, the coming of children, and the pride that settlers felt when they saw their heavy labors come to fruition. Taken as a whole, the text revealed the joys and travails of the Issei, the first generation, as they created something new and permanent. When the Japanese American experience is discussed in the media these days, invariably the focus is on the tragedy of the World War II internment. Yet the Issei experience that these texts represent predates that. Their lives were hard, they were homesick for Japan, and they encountered bias and discrimination. But at the same time, they remained focused on building new lives here. The emotions they express in the poems and prose selections were mixed, but chief among them was hope. And now I'd like to read you some some selected examples of the Japanese poems that I've included. A Night at Angel Island. In a stone prison on Angel Island, a Japanese girl is crying, leaving muddy streaks on her pale face as she clings to a chill window. From the chill window, what can be seen? Pale, eerie moonlight that keeps her from sleep. From the chill window, what can be heard? Dreamlike in the distance, white gulls faintly cry, the lingering sound of tears. A Japanese girl is crying, clinging to a chill window, muddy streaks on her face, in a stone prison on Angel Island. Many of the poems by Japanese are very, very short, haiku length or tanka length, which is only slightly longer. But frequently they be written in series, and this is a series of very short poems. She sends a wireless telegram to her picture husband and waits at the ship, hoping he will come. She is worried she'll be rejected by her husband, whose face and heart she has never seen. Although he said this season is not the best, she has counted on her fingers, and this is the joyful month. For the sake of her husband's success, she's taken jobs she's not used to, washing dishes and scrubbing floors. She yearns for her beloved husband in the picture, yet upon arrival, she sees only the heartless immigration official. The suspicion of a disease of the eye on the island a long night. Trachoma, an eye disease, was grounds for deportation at the station. So there are several poems like that. Here's one that alludes to the famous Japanese folktale Momotaro, the Peach Boy. where a boy aided by a dog, a monkey, and a pheasant defeats all the monsters on the Isle of Demons and captures their riches. He writes, arriving at Angel Island, I realize it's the Isle of Demons. On Angel Island, demon angels with protruding horns are wailing. On Angel Island, specters of demon angels all disappear. On Angel Island, in the dippers and the mortars, demon angels dwell still. When the new bride was allowed to land in America, she made sushi. I love that poem. New life and old memories. In the New Year's dawn, San Francisco looks just like Nagasaki, wrapped in mountains. Sleeping in the big city, I wake as the first dawn's light shines on skyscrapers. Autumn grass. If you come to America, where gold falls from the sky, don't despair when you tread on withered grass. She crosses to America and finds her husband is a dishwasher. Watching a friend send her children back to Japan, her face is desolate with loneliness as she sends off her infant child who knows nothing except love for his parents. She is grief-stricken by the love of her child, who is now walking away into the dim light of a second-class stateroom. Born subjects of the emperor, we live in a foreign land. At the new year, we make a toast. May your reign last forever. Camp and colony. In camp, men cook and men dance. It's spring everywhere. My first attempt at digging potatoes on a cold morning. Cold morning. The dew in a night has rusted the farm tools. Camp. Plum leaves are falling in San Jose, in the last gleam of a pale setting sun. In the distance, from the top of a bush, the broken cries of a shrike. In our corner of the tiny storeroom, I've grown tired of hearing Chico's stories of the strong liquors and the women. I wonder what the San Francisco night is really like. Only 5 o'clock and already the sun is gone. Somehow my world seems so small. I light the kerosene lamp and cook the meal. I'm on duty tomorrow. These attacks of rain and frost, the tomatoes won't stand them for long. I hated leaving my old hometown, but I'm worried about my future. As I hear the sound of the train whistle, I take off my dusty, sweaty shirt. Tomorrow it may see frost. For tonight, I feel a cold wind. Pioneer. I cleared 100 acres of land with just my own arms, under the 120-degree sun, far removed from society. The bounty wrought by the sweat of my skin has come to naught. The crop has rotted in the fields. It's another great failure. From pennilessness, without help from anyone, I raised myself up. Now to pennilessness I've returned. There's no mystery to it. With my wife and children, there are 6 of us. But after tomorrow, how will we eat? If we cannot eat, then eat this flesh of mine. Under the 120-degree sun, having just my thin arms as my stake, as a pioneer of our race, in the field of brambles, I made the flowers bloom. By Okusuke, Imperial Valley. First letter of the new year to your parents in the old country, adding a picture of our newborn baby. The presence of the 3rd generation makes grandfather into a speechless person. Gazing over our fields at New Year's first sunrise, both my thoughts and my wife's thoughts are bright with hope. History, the law, and discrimination. Just read a couple of the examples. After rising from my first dream of the year, I wipe my eyes only to see an anti-Japanese newspaper. Immigrants are forbidden. Useless is the grove in summer. This is from World War II, or World War I, excuse me. From this house too, brothers have left for war. In the window, 2 stars shine. And one last poem. For the sake of the country, we registered for the draft, yet we don't even have the right to own land. When we registered, we were almost the same as whites. With bitter smiles, we return home as Japs. Discriminatory treatment will only last a while, for the bent inchworm will stretch out again. I'd like to switch now over to Korean inscriptions. See how my time is here. We're running pretty short of time, but we'll have a time to read a few of the Korean inscriptions as well. Korean inscription to the United States and its territories up to and during the period of the Angel Island Immigration Station's operation was on a very, very small scale for both cultural and geopolitical reasons. Korea was deservedly called the Hermit Kingdom in the latter part of the 19th century. When King Gojong was crowned in 1864, he was only 12 years old. So his father, the Daewongun, literally Prince of the Great Court, assumed power and ruled in his stead. Though he attempted some positive reforms, Daewongun is mostly remembered for his radically isolationist approach to foreign relations and foreign influence. He ordered the eradication of Christianity in Korea, and the brutal campaign that followed resulted in the executions of 9 French Catholic missionaries and approximately 8,000 Korean converts. In the next decades, Korea's policy led to attacks both by France and the United States. The policy eventually led to disaster for Korea, yet not by the agency of far-flung powers, but by those close at home. With the coronation of Prince Mutsuhito as Emperor Meiji in 1868, Japan embarked upon a campaign of rapid military and industrial modernization. Qing China also modernized, though to lesser effect. Russia commenced construction on the Far East segment of the Trans-Siberian Railway in 1890, and its leaders saw political and economic benefits to extending its influence into Manchuria. Korea was caught between 3 competing powers and became a prize to be won. Yet Japan subsequently defeated China in the Sino-Japanese War of 1894-95 and Russia in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905. Japan's decisive victory stunned not only Russia, but also the world. Russia was forced to withdraw from Manchuria and to recognize that Korea was part of Japan's sphere of influence. With its rivals eliminated, Japan wasted no time. It declared Korea a Japanese protectorate in 1905 and forced the king to abdicate and took over internal administration in 1907. In 1910, Japan formally annexed Korea. The country of Korea ceased to exist. August 29th, the day the annexation was announced, was remembered by Koreans as National Humiliation Day. Between 1880 and 1902, just 50 Koreans entered the United States, mostly diplomats, students, and a few ginseng merchants. The first Korean immigration of any scale was to the territory of Hawaii between 1903 and 1905, when approximately 7,400 laborers were recruited to work on the sugarcane plantations. The emigration of laborers from Korea was stopped almost entirely in 1905 when the Japanese protectorate was announced. Many of the Koreans remaining in Hawaii left the plantations. Some moved to the Hawaiian cities, others returned to Korea. About 2,000 continued east and landed in San Francisco and other West Coast ports. About 800 resided in California, mostly in small agricultural towns like Willows, Dunaba, Reedley, and Stockton. The rest settled in neighboring states, often working railroad construction. Yet the window during which secondary migration of Korean laborers from Hawaii to the continental United States was possible was very short, as then President Theodore Roosevelt recognized Japan's authority over Korea in the Gentleman's Agreement of 1907. In the period during which the Angel Island Immigration Station operated, Korean arrivals were mostly refugees, fleeing Japanese rule. Hundreds of Korean refugees, many without passports, arrived at US continental ports in the period. These immigrants included ex-government officials and intellectuals, but most were young people claiming student status. The first step for many, as it is today for those fleeing North Korea, was to cross the Tumen or Yalu rivers into northeast China. Then they traveled to Shanghai or other Chinese ports to board passenger ships for America. The new arrivals received more of a welcome, relatively speaking, than other Asian immigrants to the United States. Their status as refugees and students gained them a measure of approval. Moreover, many were Christians, and they benefited from the advocacy of American church communities. The refugees formed the core of a Korean nationalist movement that was centered in San Francisco and Hawaii. An earlier newspaper in San Francisco was renamed Sinhan Minbo, New Korea. It became the key independent mouthpiece for all Korean nationalist aspirations through World War II, as newspapers in Korea were subject to rigorous censorship by the Japanese. It was published in San Francisco through 1941, then continued as a monthly in Los Angeles. Sinhan Minbo was in many respects a transnational newspaper. It was highly influential, so much so that the Japanese authorities considered it a dangerous source of unrest and vigorously suppressed its importation. Poetry was regularly published in Sinhan Minbo, and I'd like to share some selections. The compositions reflect the author's refugee status. Their thoughts remain firmly tied to the old country, not new life in America. Let's see. The first one or two are about Angel Island. Farewell by Jung-Do Lee in Stockton. When my heart is in pain like this, how can you be at ease? A sorrowful twilight passes on Angel Island, while a white gull wanders over the water. My heart as I leave you, your heart as you go back, leaving me behind. Ah, there is no use in crying. The only thing we have is sorrow. Can the death of a parent be compared to this? Can the death of a friend be like this? Our eyes welling with tears, an indescribable, heart-rending farewell. If we could stop the wheel of destiny, you would remain in this land. Written on the day when for the last time I visited a brother who had come with me, but was forced to return to Korea, leaving Angel Island, July 22nd, 1927. This poem is written by a Korean student at the College of the Pacific, now the University of the Pacific in one of his friends was supposed to join him, was sent back for having some kind of a tropical disease. Angel Island by Cloud. Angel Island, all the people said, so I thought it would be like heaven. Yet when the iron gate locks with a clang, it feels like hell. You, the masses of people who are wriggling in this steel-barred prison, you have a home, you have a country. So what is the reason for this sorrow? It must be a hungry belly that causes this karma. The 4th of July by a wanderer with no country. 48 stars shining, 13 stripes intertwined, playing freely in the air of freedom, proudly boasting of prosperity, the flag of the United States on the 4th of July. I envy and welcome such glory. I admire and praise such honor. The spirit of liberty nurtures you. The eagle dances for you. Who is it who sees you and thinks this way? The man with no country in the Eastern Peninsula. Hometown Thoughts by Jin Sil Son. Jin Sil Son was the daughter of the Reverend Jong-Du Son, who was an early advocate for Korean independence, and a close associate with Syngman Rhee, who later became the first president. Jin Sil Son herself later married Ji Jang-yun, who became later the first Korean ambassador to the United States. Bright moonlight in late autumn colors the eastern sky. A flying goose cries, a blowing wind chills. The faces of my loved ones vivid in my eyes. The voices of my loved ones clear in my ear. Picture my old mother standing at the gate as if waiting for me. See my little brother sitting alone as if crying for me. When I think of them, thoughts are endless. When I miss them, I feel faint. A lonely heart 10,000 miles away. All that fills my heart are thoughts of home. When the sword of the enemy flashes, my mother thinks of me. When the arrow of the enemy flies, my brother looks for me. When will we meet again? When will we see each other again? On that day, at my mother's knee, we'll pour out our sorrows. My prayer, an evil wind harshly blows. The waves of the world rise high. When wind and waves hinder my way, oh Lord, please save me. Please lead me by the hand and hold my body. When agony comes upon me, please guide me. It's just about 8. I'll just read a couple more here, and then maybe we'll switch it over to some questions. I miss you, my brother. Who can stop rushing time? It has been 8 years I have not seen you. A long 8 years of suffering and trouble has covered my forehead in lines and wrinkles. You are also a man. How could you not be changed? On a dark night, in a cold wind, falling and tumbling on a sandy shore, the memory of our crossing the Amnok still vivid in my eyes. Unforgettable Shanghai, Shanghai of the bitter taste. You go first and I'll follow after. Every single sound of our farewell song still lingers in my ears. It's been 8 years since you crossed the Atlantic. It's been 4 years since I crossed the Pacific. You in the East and me in the West. How could I not miss you? However, aren't we wanderers of destruction and people of no freedom? As I welcome the new year, I wish you good health. Pour all your blood and sweat into the success you have dreamed of. For the measure of blood and sweat sends the world of painful tears away, welcomes the land of joyful laughter, and is the shining jewel of humanity. This poem is by Yosam Ju. It was a pen name of the prominent writer Yusop Ju, who later returned to Korea and became chief editor of the Korea Times and chairman of the Korean chapter of International Pen. He spent 2 years at Stanford studying education and published in the Sinhan Minbo paper. The room in which I live is filthy, yet my life is cleaning others' houses. Arms numb, legs painful, stomach starved, exhausted body, exhausted mind. Light fades on the road at dusk as I travel home, gasping for breath. Ah, in the eastern sky, dimly, twinkle, twinkle, shining star. Hometown is a beautiful country. Homeland is my rivers and mountains. Leaning against a twig gate, waiting with a sigh, it seems if I see my mother's face. How sad is the sound of the wind. Even the wild geese fly crying. Could I see my hometown in a dream? Yet tossing and turning, I cannot sleep. Why is the moon so bright? Or to become the moon myself, quietly shining down below the window where my beloved sleeps. How plaintive the sound of crickets. The sound of falling leaves brings tears. Hoping to lighten my heavy heart, brush in hand, I sit down under the cold lamp. Though my thoughts are huge as mountains, I cannot write them out. Why is the moon so cold? Even though the letter is of only a few words, it is written with my true heart. My beloved should understand. "18 years in the United States" by one who laments the times. It's been 18 years since I came to America. Why have I spent so long floating like duckweed on the water? Looking back at my windblown footprints, what traces are left? From the ship, I first saw San Francisco in ruins. 18 years later, I see only traces of fire and collapse. Where's the devastation? When I see the glamorous buildings everywhere, I know how they have spent 18 years. Yet what have we done during that time? I left an independent country, but now I have no country. I'm a man with no place to go. Gazing at the setting sun, thinking of my home country, a sad song sung endlessly, makes me grieved and resentful. My precious youth was spent in study. but somehow I frittered it away. Look at the ruthless frost on my temples. O Creator, why so heartless? As I look east and west, present and past, where is the man who can take back Bakdu Mountain? Ah, heartless 18 years, I followed the road you made, yet my traces grow fainter and fainter, nor will we ever meet again, the patriots of the past who followed you. When we think of them, our hearts indeed are resentful. In this world, I will not meet the mountain again. The past was nothing but failure. The country was lost and houses collapsed, leaving only hope for the future. A distant future like a dream. In that future, hard to reach, we'll accomplish the dream. Great ventures will bear fruits of success. Wealth and honor will shine in the light of history. So let's forget the pain and step forward. The last poem I want to read is by someone who turned out to be a rather well-known Korean immigrant. His name was Wisok Cha, but in America he was known as let's see, what is it? Emson, Iserk Emson Char. And he wrote an autobiography about his life in Gold Mountain, which became quite well known. Sort of a self-published story of an immigrant life. Now, at one point, though, he considered going home to Korea, and this is his poem. Let's go home. Even though America is wonderful, it is not a place to live long. Asian people, let's go back to Asia. Even though this is not a barbarian land, when spring comes, it doesn't feel like spring. Though I've lived here half my life, I haven't seen a single flower. The yellow-haired alone are the masters here. Even if I live here forever, I'll always feel the sorrow of a foreign land. Though making a living is easy, life is more than eating. I won't allow discrimination and contempt to make me live like an exile. Though everywhere in Asia is poor, there too are sources of wealth. Let's take up hoes and dig the ground with our own hands. The Philippines is hot, but for poor people, the living is easy. And on the vast fertile plain of China, one can live for long. Though the oppression of foes is terrible, the hills and rivers of my country are mine. Koreans to Korea, let's go home and live. Even though America is wonderful, it's not a place to live long. Let's quickly pack our bags and cross the Pacific. Thank you. I think I'll stop here and happy to take any questions.
Okay, I'm back, and we do have a number of questions. I did want to point out to everyone that attendees can see all of the questions that have been answered. I just changed it so that you've been able to see the questions, because one of the questions that comes from Kimberly Wong actually contains information about a presentation about a paper daughter, which is going to occur tomorrow night. So it's time is of the essence. So I'm allowing you all to look at that and the other questions as well. One basic question from a listener concerns the Chinese, Japanese, and Koreans' possible relationships with one another. So what, if any, relationships were there between Chinese, Japanese, and Korean immigrants?
At Angel Island Immigration Station, very little, because the whole building was separated by ethnicity and race. This whole period, before World War II, race dictated almost everything. So the two largest dormitories, there's one on the first floor and one on the second floor, were solely for Chinese, and that's where a majority of the Chinese inscriptions are found. Then on the other side of the building, on the first floor and second floor, were the dormitories for Europeans, Japanese, and others. Now, Japanese, I think, were allowed to go in there, as opposed to being put in with the Chinese, because Japan was a strong country, and Japan was diplomatically, formidable. So their treatment at the station tended to be better. than was the treatment meted out to the Chinese. They tended to be there for a very short time, generally speaking, both the picture brides and then also male immigrants who went through. They also was a short amount of time because the Japanese government was also overseeing immigration. So the Japanese government wouldn't give people passports unless they were legit, right? So the average stay for a Japanese immigrant was only a couple, 3 days, whereas the average for Chinese immigrants could be 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks. The longest on record, I think, was 762 days, I think, for a Chinese immigrant, right? And and there were guards in the building in the middle, so it's not like these groups were fraternizing in the building. There were separate eating areas for Europeans, and the Chinese as well.
Okay.
You see the bottom of the stair behind me. That's where the dining halls were. So there's actually if you go to the station, they put picnic tables out, so we often eat lunch there. That is the old dining room. That's the Asian dining room, and then the European dining room was on the other side.
Okay. There's actually a question that is related to the space inside of the barracks. Someone wants to know, was there lots of space for people to write their poems on the walls? In other words, was it kind of a crowded environment and some guy had to, squeeze himself into a corner to inscribe on the walls, or did they have a lot of space as far as you could tell?
It is a big drafty wooden building, and so there is a lot of wall space, but some wall space is better than others. Like, who's going to get up and carve a poem up by the ceiling? So in the areas which were sort of like say between your waist and between above your head, all the way around in the Chinese dormitories, most of that space is filled. Right. And sometimes the poems are so close together, they look like they're running into each other. You realize they're different because the calligraphy might be different or the rhyme scheme might be different. Right. It seems pretty clear, although not many of the poems are dated, but some of them are, that most of the poems on the walls were early. Even though the building was 1910 to 1940. I think that most of the Chinese poems were there before 1925, thereabouts. Maybe even 1920. So yes, they ran out of space. The other language inscriptions don't take too much space because they weren't writing long poems. They were writing very, very short little inscriptions. With the Japanese, it might be names and dates or places of origin, and same with the Russians and various groups like that. So that looks more like graffiti, although for historical research, it's actually quite useful because you have some place to start when you're trying to trace the travels of an individual and then their descendants.
Right. Yeah. Just so everyone knows, if you're contemplating purchasing and reading this book, one of the really fascinating things about it is how Charles does so much with a little bit of information. He'll get somebody who's inscribed their name on the wall with the name of the ship they arrived on, then the place they were from in East Asia or Russia or someplace, and he'll take that and run with it and look at all kinds of documents and piece together that person's life from that time forward, and even in some cases interview their descendants. So it's a real treat for those of you who are interested in that kind of thing. Now, by the way, there is another question about the inscriptions on the walls by Chinese relative to the other groups, which is, why are there so many poems inscribed on the walls by Chinese while most non-Chinese inscriptions had little more than a person's name and the date that they were at Angel Island?
Well, I had a little section, when I was talking about the giving the context for the Chinese Immigrants, Inscriptions at the beginning, where I mentioned that it was a cultural practice in China to inscribe on the walls, right? You know, and the idea of the written word and sort of human thought, you know, it brings life to place. Give good example. You know, when we think in the States of like going to nature, we think of going to Yosemite, which is like it's as if there was never a human being there at all. We're going back to this primordial state. Whereas if you go to a scenic place in China, you might see calligraphy carved into the stones at the top of the mountain, you know, because it's like it's the place without the human imprint on it was somehow incomplete, right? So that's the idea, I think, of you know, of adding words to place as a way of sort of personalizing it, and also you know, making it more part of society. But then the other part of it is, and there's also this long tradition of protest poetry in China, right? And some of that was also written on walls, 提笔诗, you know, so they were combining these things here. They writing a poem on the wall was a cultural act for the Chinese. That same sort of impetus, you know, wasn't part of the cultures of Japan and Korea so much, right? And so that didn't mean that they weren't writing poetry. It's just they didn't necessarily feel the compulsion to carve it on the walls, right? And you know, so what they were doing really is more in the tradition of like, you know, I was here. I like to think of it as like, I mentioned this in the book too. I like to think of it in terms of Independence Rock, you know, out in Wyoming, which is a national historic site, because the pioneers, when they went by, they carved their names on the rock, you know. And so I think Angel Island is the Independence Rock of immigration history.
Yeah. Well, there's another question very closely related to that. And I think of this because you talked about all the background that you're familiar with from your studies of how inscribing words on walls and stones and so forth is so much a part of Chinese history and culture. What were your feelings when you first visited the Angel Island Immigration Station barracks and saw all those Chinese inscriptions on its walls?
Yeah, it's a fascinating. Yeah, it was really a visceral experience, because when I went there, it was before the restoration, and it was still in very, very bad shape. The roof needed to be redone. There had been like some of the wall inscriptions were lost to rain damage, and there were places on the second floor you had to watch where you were walking, or else you might fall through, you know. But so we went in. It was kind of a chilly day. It's always kind of drafty in there, and we go in, and you know, like it's sort of echo. Your steps echo around when you arrive. And if you're standing in the middle of the room, nothing much looks remarkable. It looks like a lot of these sort of period buildings in San Francisco, like in the Presidio or in Fort Mason. It sort of looks like that, but it's not. But that's because the authorities had puttied and painted over all the inscriptions. So until you actually get up close, you often don't see them, you know. So if you're standing in the middle of the room looking, you might see a few smudges on the wall, but it's not till you walk up to it you realize that it's just dozens and dozens and dozens of poems. So yeah, it was fascinating and very moving, and also for me, because I love puzzles, you know. I saw, wow, look at all these puzzles. You know, we could sort of try to figure out what all these things mean, you know.
Yeah, that makes me think of something that you report in the book, which is how amazing it was that all of these immigrants none of whom were high-level scholars before they left China, had such a command of these word puzzles, which Chinese poems are, and such a command of fine calligraphy. And as you point out, the average immigrant coming from China today probably would not have the kind of skill that these turn of the century, in many cases, as you point out, young Chinese men had from their traditional schooling.
Right, because the traditional schooling had ended about that time, and so calligraphy, is a hobby of some people now, but it's not a universal skill, right? And same with poetry writing. Now, I should say that we can't take the inscriptions, the poems on the walls, as representative of the educational level of all of the immigrants who went through the building. The poem writers were self-selected, right? So there may have been plenty of people there who did not have that sort of school background enough to do that. That said, though, I think it is worth pointing out that this 1910 and 1940 period for Chinese immigration is wholly unlike the 19th century period. 19th century was the period of of railroad workers, coming over. So these weren't in any case people who were planning to stay. They were probably coming to make some money and then try to go back home to China. In the 1910 to 1940 period, however, because the exclusion law was so strict, it was like the men and boys who came over would be like the smartest kid in their village. They're like the ones that people thought could succeed somehow, and so I wouldn't say that all of the immigrants who came through in this period could have written poetry, or done the calligraphy that well, but it was not a untrained, unschooled group in general.
Okay, so there's a kind of a final set of questions, all of which have to do with your book and possibly any other sources people might want to read to become more educated about the Angel Island phenomenon. Now, I did write into the response of one of the persons who wants to know the exact title of your book, but I will read it. Voices of Angel Island, Inscriptions and Immigrant Poetry, 1910 to 1945. It's a current publication, so it's a 2021 publication, and it's certainly available on Amazon.com. That's how I acquired it. And Charles, do you know of any other ways by which it might be acquired?
Well, the publisher is Bloomsbury Academic, which is the academic arm of Bloomsbury, which is a huge, public publishing firm. I think I might have sent you, Chris, the flyer that had a discount number on the back.
That's correct. It was a flyer for the presentation you gave to the Japanese American Historical Society.
Correct. And you're welcome to share that flyer.
Okay.
It's the flyer for the book, and then the second page was an ordering from Bloomsbury at a discount. Because one of the sad things about academic books is they jack up the price because their major market is the libraries, so they want the libraries to buy them.
Okay.
I'm hoping one of these days. I hope one day we'll have a paperback for this, but I don't know when that's going to happen.
Mm-hmm. All right. San Jose State University Library has it as an ebook, and
Yep.
I assume
you can do that too, right?
I assume San Francisco State University probably has the book and or the ebook.
I hope so, and if they don't, I'm going to give them a talking to.
Yeah, and the other question is, in addition to your book, are there other things you'd recommend that people should read?
Oh, two books for sure. One I showed at the beginning is the book by him, Mark Lai, Judy Young, and Jenny Lim, Island. You know, the book that really sort of put Angel Island on the map. And I really like the revised version, which came out in 2014, because it has many new oral histories and much more context. Excellent introduction. Very sad to say that Judy Young, the historian who was, you know, so instrumental in that book, just recently passed away. You know, which was very sad for you know, everybody connected with the station. But you know, that's a really great book. Another book, which is a more historical look at it, and it's a look not only at Chinese immigration but at all the different groups, is Erica Lee and Judy Young wrote a book called Angel Island. Oh wait, yeah, I think it's called Angel Island, and it has chapters on each of the different groups that went through, and you know, puts them all in context. I sort of followed that model when I was doing this book.
Okay, well, that's great. So I know we're running to the end of our time, so I'd like to thank you very much on behalf of the members of Chinese Historical and Cultural Project, and also of ACNA, Africana, Asian American, Chicano, and Native American Studies Center at King Library, San Jose State University, and to all of the others who found out about this webinar and attended it. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you. And thank you for having me.
Okay, and
Thanks
good night all.
Thanks everyone for listening.